Hey everyone, welcome to the first deck tech of this channel. Today we're going to be looking at Temur Tarmodrazi. So the way these deck techs are going to work is that I'm going to go through the main board, the main 60 cards, and then I'm going to go through the sideboard relatively quickly. But I want to break down every card in the main deck, starting with creatures and moving our way down. And kind of explaining, the reasoning why those cards are in the deck, what use they serve, and how I play those cards in different matchups. So I'm hoping you're going to find this deck tech and future deck techs interesting and useful, and I'm hoping to start conversations with you guys as well. Because the only way a deck gets better is by having other people enjoy it, play it, and start discussing different card choices. So let's jump right into it. Let's start with creatures. So here are all the creatures. Let's start off with Noble Hierarch. If you've been in Modern at all, or any Legacy formats at all, or Eternal formats I should say, Noble Hierarch. Noble Hierarch helps us ramp into our threats, and that's really the main purpose that Noble Hierarch plays. But there are many different angles of attack that you can use with Noble Hierarch. Okay, so generally speaking, you want it to come down turn 1, which means that by turn 2 you have potentially 3 to 4 mana available to you, depending on what other lands you have in your hand. This is significant because this means that, technically speaking, turn 2 you could have a Thought-Knot Seer, which is really powerful. I mean, the only other scenario where you could have a turn 2 Thought-Knot Seer is if your opening hand or your first draw include a total of 2 Eldrazi Temples, which don't happen often. You have a much greater chance of having 1 Eldrazi Temple, 1 Noble Hierarch, and 1 land. And that means you get to have a turn 2 4/4 body that also exiles a card of your choice from your opponent's hand, and that's relevant, and that happens often enough. You could also have a turn 2 Tarmogoyf with Stubborn Denial mana available to you, which is also relevant. We can grow our Tarmogoyfs relatively quickly in this build. So you could have a 3/4 or potentially even a 4/5 Tarmogoyf by turn 2 or 3, depending on what your opening hand was. And again, that's relatively that's non-trivial. So Noble Hierarch is definitely a necessary card. It helps us run 19 lands alongside Traverse the Elvenwald. And Exalted is not a trivial mechanic. You already have a 5/5 Trampling Reality Smasher, but imagine if it's a 6/6 or a 7/7. I've had that happen on more than one occasion, and I promise you it feels amazing every time, and it's just scary. I mean, even your 4/4 Thought-Knot Seer becomes a 5/5, whatever it may be. It's just a good all-around card. I don't think I need to spend too much more time in Noble Hierarch. There's a reason why the card's expensive on paper. It's because it's just very powerful, and a lot of decks want to play it. Next up is Tarmogoyf, one of the main namesakes of this deck. Listen, Tarmogoyf is one of my most favorite Magic cards. It's definitely, I believe, my number 1 favorite creature. It's kind of lost favor in the past couple of years thanks to Fatal Push and other efficient removal that has entered into the game, but I still think that Tarmogoyf has a strong competitive edge, and I don't think that's necessarily controversial. There's still plenty of top tier decks that play Tarmogoyf, and that's because it's just an efficient beater. It's a fair, efficient beater. It gets bigger as the graveyards get bigger to a limit, and you got to work a bit to get Tarmogoyf up to the 4/5, 5/6, 6/7 ranges. But it's just an efficient 2 mana beater, and this deck wouldn't exist in this current form if Tarmogoyf didn't exist. So Yeah, I love Tarmogoyf. You will or already do love Tarmogoyf. Yeah, it's awesome here, and it plays very well with Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher, in the sense that they don't fight each other for resources. Up next is Thought-Knot Seer. So I have mixed feelings about Thought-Knot Seer, not because I don't think it's a good card. It obviously is. It allows you to exile a card from your opponent's hand. It's a 4/4 body. In decks like this, it could come down turn 2 or turn 3. That's all relevant, and that's all very threatening. The main thing about Thought-Knot Seer is that I really hate it when it dies, because it really feels bad when your opponent draws a card. It really does. Now, I mean, you have to keep in mind you did exile a card from their hand when Thought-Knot Seer came onto the battlefield, but it doesn't matter, because when he dies, he's replaced. So, I mean, the card that he took is replaced. So it's really, it's a double-edged sword in my opinion. But I still, that being said, that's just the way I feel. I still wouldn't remove it from this deck. You need it. Thought-Knot Seer is great in all other respects. It does force your opponents to kind of do desperate plays by, for example, throwing a bunch of removal at it or sacrificing a bunch of their creatures to kill it so that they can draw that card. So it kind of acts like a lightning rod, which is relevant. I've had that happen many times, and it actually works in our favor oftentimes. So, sometimes you hope that your opponent tunnel visions onto Thought-Knot Seer, just so they could get a card draw out of it. But in reality, they're ignoring your other threats on the board. So, yeah, Thought-Knot Seer, again, you need 4 of, and you never remove any from the deck, when you're sideboarding. Up next is Reality Smasher. Again, it's a 4 of. It's your finisher. It's your big beater. It can come down as quickly as turn 3. And it's a 5/5 trampler. And that's just crazy. Let's be honest. To remove it is a pain, because if you have any spells to remove it that target it, you have to discard a card. That's super relevant. Again, it's just when Delirium is active on Traverse, 9 times out of 10, I'm tutoring for a Reality Smasher. So, it's a super important card. Again, I think if Reality Smasher didn't exist, and there was nothing really to compare to it, this deck wouldn't really exist in its current form. It wouldn't be a thing. Up next are the 2 what I would consider the flex slots in terms of creatures in this deck. These are creatures that you could in theory remove and put in something else, and the deck would still work. But I've found that having a 1/of Euro and a 1/of of Colossus actually served me pretty good in a lot of my matchups, and I think they're fine main board. Colossus used to be a sideboard card, but I did move it into the main. Let's start with Euro. For 3 mana, you're gaining 3 life, which is relevant in a deck where our lands cause us a lot of pain, a lot more than many other decks. So 3 mana can be relevant for us. It does help us by drawing a card and ramping into a second land drop for the turn, if you have enough lands in your hand. So again, that's super relevant for turn 3 or potentially turn 2 if you have Noble Hierarch. Because you could more comfortably, for example, cast a Thought-Knot Seer, let's say on a turn 3, and have Stubborn Denial mana up. Same goes for Reality Smasher on a turn later. Euro does a lot, even just for his 3 mana cast. I have at times used his escape cost to actually cast him and have him as a 6/6 body on the battlefield, but you don't really need to do that. Just as a one-off spell, doing what he does is relevant, and I've found it to be relatively a useful card to draw, even to top deck mid to late game, because it usually means that mid to late game you're going to cast it for 3 mana, and next turn you're going to escape it if you really need it. So again, of Euro, but it is a card that you could remove if you really needed to, or you just didn't really like him. Up next is Colossus. So this was a card that I was also 50-50 on. It used to be a sideboard card, but I feel that it does have a place in the main board. The ramping ability, if you exile a land, can be useful, but 99% of the time I'm using its second ability, which is essentially a 4-point life swing. You gain 2 life, your opponent loses 2 life. In games where you're grinding out, where it's a board stall, this is basically a game finisher. In 4 turns, you're taking away 8 life from your opponent, and you're gaining 8 life, which is a scenario that happens often when games are grinding out. That's super relevant. It's indestructible, so it's hard for your opponent to remove, and you don't need to eat your own graveyard to start off with, which means you can keep Delirium active, for example. And since you can be selective, if you want to keep your Tarmogoyf big, you can start eating lands in graveyards, and then keeping your Tarmogoyfs as big as they can be. So I've never really had an issue of Klothys fighting off our Tarmogoyfs, and honestly, if it's gotten to the point where Klothys is now eating at your Tarmogoyf, you're probably still winning anyway, because you're bringing your opponent closer to zero life. So that's it for the creatures. Let's move on to our instants and sorceries. So starting with the instants, let's get Lightning Bolt out of the way. It's a 4 of. If I need to explain to you what Lightning Bolt does or why it's important, you're in the wrong everything. don't play eternal formats. But let's be serious. Lightning Bolt, 3 mana, 1 mana, 3 damage. Efficient removal. Mana Leak is up next, and it makes for our permission package. We don't have too much permission, but we have enough. We have a 1-off Mana Leak in the main board. We have 2 Mana Leaks in the sideboard, and sometimes you need to. Mana Leak is really there to counter creatures more than anything else. We do have big creatures, but sometimes they could take a bit of time to get onto the battlefield, and sometimes we need to stabilize beforehand, or sometimes we just don't want to have to deal with big creatures on the other side. We just want our big creatures to smash in and not have to deal with a Glory Bringer or opposing Reality Smashers or whatever it may be. So Mana Leak as a 1-of in the main makes sense. It's worked well. You can play around if you feel you don't want to play with four Stubborn Denials, and you could play around with the composition, I feel, and it would still work. But I found that the 4-1 split works just fine. Speaking of Stubborn Denial, that's the next card we'll cover. It's a 4-of. Most of the time, you really want to cast it with Ferocious active, and it's just an awesome card. There are so many times I've had gotcha moments where where Stubborn Denial with Ferocious wins me the game. It stops. Oftentimes I'll time walk opponents when they're casting Metamorphose, for example, and it's just a card that the opponent doesn't see coming. Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smasher unconditionally trigger Ferocious. Tarmogoyf gets big pretty quickly in this deck, and it'll trigger Ferocious. So if for whatever reason Uro has been cast and he's on the battlefield, he'll trigger it. Klothys triggers it if you ever get to the required devotion. So all of your creatures other than Noble Hierarch trigger Ferocious, and it's just a super powerful 1 mana essentially counter spell for non-creature spells. It's the main reason you're splashing for blue. Let's be honest. You want a counter package, but what you really want is Stubborn Denial. I can't say enough about Stubborn Denial. I really love that card, and you will love playing with Stubborn Denial if you have not before. Last but not least, Tarfire. Anytime I'm playing a Tarmogoyf deck that's also playing red, I probably have Tarfire somewhere in the 75, and most likely in the main board. Listen, you're really playing it because of the tribal instant. It helps you grow Tarmogoyf early on, but any extra removal helps. It's more than enough to kill, turn 1 Arbor Elves, Noble Hierarchs, Golden Goose, whatever it is that you want to remove. Tarfire does the job. It doesn't really miss that often. And worst case, it could go to your opponent's face if there's no valid targets on the battlefield. So, it's really there to grow your Tarmogoyf And yeah, not much else there. Moving on to sorceries, you have a 4 of Ancient Stirrings and a 4 of Traverse the Elvenwald. For me, these are things that the sorceries in this deck don't get touched. You have a 4 of both, and they stay 4 of in every game. You never remove Traverse, you never remove Ancient Stirrings, to side in a card from your sideboard. Starting with Ancient Stirrings, we do run slightly less colorless spells or colorless cards in this deck because we are splashing blue. For example, we're not running 4 of reality matter reshapers, which are common in the red-green Eldrazi builds, but that's okay. Most of the times you're gonna at the very least get a land, and if you're not, it's because there's a Thought-Knot Seer or Reality Smasher. They're up for grabs. On rare occasions, you'll have Mishra's Bauble, and sometimes you just won't get anything at all. But that doesn't happen too often. Ancient Stirrings is very, very powerful. It helps you keep starting hands that have no threats because you can dig for your threats, 5 cards deep, which is relevant. So yeah, Ancient Stirrings, powerful. You need it. Don't even think about removing it. Next up is Traverse the Elvenwald. Again, another great card. Early in the early game, it allows you to make sure you hit your land drops. If you're short on land drops, it also helps you keep 1 land hands or 2 land hands because you can get a third at the very least, or it can be a backup if you have a 1 land hand of Noble Hierarch and Noble Hierarch gets removed. You can still use Traverse to get your second land and keep going. Mid to late game, it's essentially a tutor. It's a 6 mana Reality Smasher essentially. Almost every time you're going for a Reality Smasher when Delirium is active. So ultra powerful card. And most of the time when you're when you're tutoring for Reality Smasher, you're also casting at the same turn. It's just something that your opponent doesn't necessarily expect, and it helps you ramp into your threats, which is super important. So again, Traverse the Elvenwald, a key component to the deck, and you will enjoy playing with it. Last but not least, before we hit the lands, we're playing 4 times Mishra's Bauble. Listen, it's a 0 mana artifact that helps you grow Tarmogoyf, helps you draw a card, and helps you see what's on top of your opponent's deck or your deck. How much more can I say here on Mishra's Bauble? Keep it. I suppose if Mishra's Bauble was banned for whatever reason, I would replace it with Serum Visions, but it's nowhere comparable to Mishra's Bauble in what it does. On that note, actually, notice we don't play Serum Visions anywhere in the 75. I used to have Serum Visions in earlier iterations. I didn't have a full playset. I had maybe 1 or 2. I just didn't. One of Serum Visions was a waste. It was just too inconsistent. In the games that you would draw it was great, but you would draw it very rarely, and I felt that it was kind of a useless card to have of just a 1 of. You usually want 3-4 ofs of Serum Visions, and Mishra's Baubles just played better in this case. So this is why we don't run Serum Visions, and I don't think you would need to in this build. So moving on to lands, we have 19 lands. I played more before, I just found it was way too much. You have 4 times Noble Hierarch, you have 4 times Traverse the Elvenwald, you have 4 times Ancient Stirrings, you have 4 times Mishra's Baubles, you have 1 time Euro. There are a ton of cards in this deck that allow you to find a land, essentially. So I find 19 is a good number. It's enough that you don't have too many games where your starting 7 have no lands. What's important to note here, though, is that a problem that I had early on in this build is that I would get Noble Hierarch in my opening hand, but none of the lands that I had produced green mana. So, for example, I used to run Steam Vent land. The name escapes me right now, but the red-blue Pain land. and that just it's essentially a mulligan at that point, and it's crazy because the rest of the hand could be good, but because you can't produce green mana, Noble Hierarch is useless, and then everything just kind of, everything just kind of goes downhill. So what I've done is I've reduced the amount of lands that don't produce green, and you can see that from here. The only lands that remain that don't produce green are obviously Eldrazi Temple, Wastes, a mountain that's a one-of, and an island that's a one-of. Every other land in the deck either produces green or has the ability for you to fetch a land that produces green, and that's exactly how it should be. I would caution against modifying the land composition here to include other lands that do not produce green, because I'm warning you, you will find those scenarios occur quite often, and it just sucks, because you're essentially forced to take a mulligan, and it's just not good. And then you go down to 6, and then 6 bad, and you go down to 5, and then all of a sudden you want to quit the game. So this is the land that we have. The land that I'm showing you right now is just really something that's evolved over time as I've iterated. You could probably play around, if you want less Carpulsan forests, or you want more Yavimaya coasts. You can play around with their their numbers, but just make sure that the amount of green producers stays relatively the same. I don't think I need to spend too much more time on the lands. Most of them are pretty straightforward. Eldrazi Temple, let's be serious here. It produces 2 mana if you're casting an Eldrazi spell, and that's amazing. So, I do keep note. I don't have Cavern of Souls here. There's a few reasons for that. First of all, there's just no space. There's just no space for Cavern of Souls. Also, it doesn't produce green mana, which is an issue for Noble Hierarch. And I'm less concerned about our creatures getting countered. Remember, keep in mind that we have our own counters. So if we're playing a deck that's counter heavy, we could always play a bit slower, which we're going to inevitably have to do anyway if our opponent is looking to counter our spells, and wait until we have counter magic mana up to be able to play our spells and then have something to defend them with. So yeah, that's the main reason why I don't have Cavern of Souls. But you could put it in there, remove another land. But again, I don't think you need Cavern of Souls, and you definitely can't fit more than one unless you drastically change the deck. So moving on to the sideboard. I don't want to spend too much time on the sideboard because I feel like this is super meta dependent, and I'm going to say this in every deck tech. I mean, what people are playing in your local gaming store will heavily influence what's in your sideboard. But we'll go through the cards really quickly because I think some of these cards are pretty much universal, and you'd want them all the time anyway. Let's start with Alpine Moon. So it's a 3-of. You can't run Blood Moon in this deck. I really wish you could, but you really, really can't. So Alpine Moon is your next best bet. It comes in against any decks that have lands you need to shut off. So Tron, Scapeshift, anything playing Valakut essentially. Those are all decks where Alpine Moon comes in, and you need to draw it in those decks, generally speaking, or you really want to. So a 3-of is kind of mandatory in this case. Up next is Anger of the Gods. This is mostly for decks that go wide relatively quickly, or just have just a lot of bodies that just are going to get in the way of your Reality Smasher, your Thought-Knot Seer, Merfolk, token decks, other aggro decks. Anger of the Gods is important. It's also useful against Dredge because it's exiling the creatures, so they're not going to go to graveyard. They'll never be able to play them again. So Anger of the Gods can come in for many matchups and is very useful. Cindervines has really grown on me. It's actually helped me win quite a few games. Not necessarily because it helped me remove an artifact or enchantment I needed to remove, but because it stayed on the board for 3-4 turns before I sacrificed it, and our opponent took a bunch of damage casting non-creature spells. It's essentially GG if you played against Storm and they can't remove it. It's a great card. It comes in handy against a lot of decks. You'd be surprised. So, yeah, Cindervines. I have a 2-of. I think it's enough. You don't want more than that, really. and it's really our only way of destroying artifacts and enchantments in this deck. Damping Sphere. I used to play more of these until I realized that you just really don't want these with how they turn off your Eldrazi temples. So it kind of goes against our game plan. So a 1-of is fine, mostly because it's there to, again, deal with Tron, deal with Storm as well. Again, you don't see Storm too much, but you do see a lot of Tron. This is a card that you could probably remove and put something else in there. Maybe a 4th Alpine Moon or something else. I feel that right now it plays a role in enough games that I could keep it in there. But again, this is something you would probably remove depending on your local meta. Grafdigger's Cage is next. 3-of. Great card. I don't think I need to explain too much which decks it comes in against. Mostly Dredge. But it could come in against other decks as well that kind of abuse cards coming onto the battlefield from the graveyard, or getting cast from the graveyard, whatever it may be. Any combo decks that are fetching for cards in their library, Grafdigger's Cage comes in for those games. Magmatic Sinkhole is a 1-of. I bring it in against any deck that's playing a lot of Planeswalkers, or a deck that has just a lot of creatures that are relatively big and that we need to deal with, and that we don't necessarily want to trade our Reality Smashers with or our Thought-Knot Seers with. So it's a 1-of. I think it's enough given the fact that we have a bunch of other removal and permission available to us. So, I mean, again, this is something you could probably play around with. I mean, you could potentially remove a Damping Sphere and add a second Magmatic Sinkhole if you really wanted to. Up next, 2 times Mana Leak. This is really, this is there to complement the permission package we already have in the main 60. Bringing it in against decks, combo decks, control decks, even burn decks, believe it or not. Burn decks, using burn decks as an example, burn generally runs out of gas relatively quickly. They want to kill you as soon as possible, and they don't want games to drag out. But if you use your Mana Leaks and your Stubborn Analysis to kind of stabilize early on and fend off most of their burn spells, that means you could then start casting your large creatures and start finishing off burn. And it's a strategy that's worked for me quite well. Last but not least, Obstinate Baloth. I bring this in against decks that have discard strategies. Also against burn. I mean, don't forget you do have ramp in this deck. So you can get the 4-land relatively quickly. You can get double green relatively easily. And 4 mana is useful. Again, we have painful lands, so 4 mana helps. 4 life helps. And that does it for the sideboard. Again, I didn't want to spend too much time on the sideboard. This will change in 6 months as the meta changes. 6 months is generous. It might change in 3 months. What I would really like to focus on is the main 60. So I hope you found this deck tech useful. It's the first one. I know it's a bit rough around the edges, but I'm working on it. If you enjoyed the video, please like it. I really appreciate a subscribe to support the channel, and make sure that you get future notifications for future deck techs I'll be posting, future matches, and other types of videos that I'm slowly planning on releasing. And yeah, stay tuned for the Delver of Brews website as well, which will be coming later this year. Cool, thanks, and have a good one.